You know someone is messed up when the first words out of their mouth after denying SA is that the statute of limitations is already up. How do you know that, man? Did you already look it up? Greetings, fellow mortals. Just a reminder, saying it's just my opinion is for cowards. The first thing that I thought when I heard about Netflix's Vince McMahon documentary is that it wasn't going to happen because he wouldn't let it happen. He has to be one of the biggest control freaks that I've ever seen. As such, I was not shocked at all when I heard that he tried to buy back the footage and then eventually tried to have the entire series cancelled when he didn't get his way. This absolute genius of a human being even made a statement before the documentary dropped in order to cover his bases. And guess what? It was some of the best advertisement that the documentary could have gotten. I don't regret participating in this Netflix documentary. The producers had an opportunity to tell an objective story about my life and the incredible business I built, which were equally fulfilled with excitement, drama, fun, and a fair amount of controversy and life lessons. Unfortunately, based on an early partial cut I've seen, this doc falls short and takes the predictable path of conflating the Mr. McMahon character with my true self, Vince. A lot has been misinterpreted or left out entirely in an effort to leave viewers intentionally confused. The producers use typical editing tricks with out of context footage and dated sound bits, etc. to distort the viewer's perception and support a deceptive narrative. In an attempt to further their misleading account, the producers use a lawsuit based on an affair I ended as evidence that I am in fact Mr. McMahon. I hope the viewer will keep an open mind and remember that there are two sides to every story. That's right, there are two sides to every story, but guess what, Mr. McMahon? Your side of the story is absolutely...
This is worthless.
It's less than worthless, my boy.
And after watching the full series, I have to say I don't know what Vince McMahon was talking about at all, because the Netflix documentary crew was very, very fair. The problem was the fact that Vince screwed Vince. His actions and words were so damning that all Netflix had to do was just state the facts. In truth, the Mr. McMahon documentary is actually a small WWE documentary. The first 5 episodes are dedicated to the highlights of the WWE, which was the WWF, which was the WWWF. The documentary really begins when Vince Jr. joins his father's company. Vince Jr. eventually buys Vince Sr.'s company and then starts to expand it around the country. He poaches talent from all of the various different territories and then eventually puts said territories out of business. These wrestlers range from Hulk Hogan to the Macho Man Randy Savage to Rowdy Roddy Piper. Yeah, the most famous wrestlers to ever live. You can see why Vince McMahon won in the end. And throughout this entire part, we are forced to see and hear Hulk Hogan over and over and over again. And if there's one thing that you need to know about Hulk Hogan is that when he opens his mouth, he's going to lie. They go through many different scandals, including wrestlers hurting reporters for calling wrestling fake. And I know that sounds tempting, but you can't lay your hands on people for just saying words. They also have many different instances of SA, including a female referee and many different ring boys. Not to mention the steroid trials where Vince McMahon managed to avoid being convicted by the federal government of selling drugs to his wrestlers.
Where did you get the money for this?
Drugs. I sell hardcore drugs.
Oh, good. You started helping out with the mortgage then.
Yeah, you wish.
They go through the Monday Night Wars with WCW, with the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. Not to mention the Montreal Screwjob. Man, there can't be a single wrestling documentary that does not bring that up. But at least in this case, it is necessary because it is the situation which led to Vince McMahon becoming an on-air character. Vince's interactions with all of the different wrestlers, including Stone Cold and The Rock, is what led to him eventually beating WCW and purchasing the company. Although it is difficult to say that WWE won the war when WCW was just getting in its own way with every single possible turn. The documentary also pointed out the difference in the content of television from back then compared to today. From the early 2000s to the 90s to the 80s to even before that, you could not get away with some of the obvious caricatures, racism, and sexism that was involved. A lot of things in wrestling you can look back and just cringe, but here's the thing, wrestling is a reflection of culture, so trying to erase the art of wrestling in those days is basically erasing history and just trying to forget it all. Look at the cringy stuff from the past, learn from it, and do better. Don't erase it, because that's just stupid.
Wait!
And I'm talking about the in-ring stuff, not the controversies backstage, because post-Attitude Era, even when they went PG, things were still bad. Women were still not held in high regard for a long time until Vince McMahon decided that he wanted to earn money in a different way from the women, meaning actually treating them like athletes. And they kind of skipped through the PG era with John Cena because not a whole lot happened on stage, but backstage, there were still controversies. And that leads up to modern day, where the documentary takes a little bit of a turn with episode 6, nailing every single controversy to Vince McMahon's back, kicking him out the door, and then pissing on him while he's on the ground. They go through Vince McMahon's latest sex and alleged SA scandals, including Janelle Grant's gruesome lawsuit depicting all of the different terrible things that Vince McMahon did to her, resulting in McMahon eventually resigning from his role in the company, but then forcing his way back in against everyone's wishes, including his own daughters, who left the company right after he came back. But then he sold the WWE only to get kicked out of any possible active role within the company, and eventually completely bought out, meaning that he has no interest in the WWE and wrestling anymore at all.
I don't know nothing about how I do anything. Whoa!
And that's a basic summary of the documentary. And from my point of view, it's Netflix basically trying to separate WWE from Vince McMahon altogether. And rightfully so, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. What the Mr. McMahon documentary actually ended up being was Netflix covering all of their bases. You see, Netflix just reached a gigantic agreement with WWE to live stream their main show on Monday every single week for years. From a storytelling perspective, the Netflix controversy accomplished a few things. Number one, it completely condemned Mr. McMahon. All the documentary did was lay out the facts, get Mr. McMahon to comment on them, and then leave you to decide what you think. And guess what? Because you're not completely biased towards McMahon, you're probably going to think that this guy is nuts or evil. They even pointed out different storylines that Vince McMahon put himself in and then had people comment on it, with even his children and his most trusted confidants basically saying, yeah, Vince McMahon is basically the same as the Mr. McMahon character. Next, it covered almost every single major scandal that happened within the WWE and pinned it on Vince McMahon, meaning now that Vince is out of the WWE, the company is squeaky clean and Netflix is the good guy for being willing to do business now that the evil guy is away from the company. This prevents Netflix from being blindsided by being associated with all of these different scandals. If anyone gets mad at Netflix for their first attempt at weekly live television, they can just point at the documentary and say, hey, we're already covered, the bad guy is gone, get over it, we're trying to move on and build something new.
If you build it, they will come. Wow, Billy Martin, you're my idol.
And finally, this documentary functions as a recap and advertisement for WWE coming to Netflix. They recapped basically everything you need to know about the past from this company and said, hey, isn't this form of entertainment weird? Wouldn't you like to watch it? I mean, you already have a Netflix account, so it'll be included. Watch it every week live on Monday nights. In that sense, this documentary is completely perfect for normies, meaning non-wrestling fans. And here's the thing you need to know about me. I despise wrestling, meaning that I am completely obsessed with it. On television and backstage, it is the weirdest thing that you have ever seen. I swear, some of the stories that come out about what's happening behind the scenes is a lot more interesting than what's happening on your television. Every single scandal and event that was mentioned within this documentary could basically have a documentary of its own without it being boring at all. There is so much information about what is happening at these various points in time. There are a ton of podcasts, YouTube videos, and TV shows just about the backstage drama. Go watch Dark Side of the Ring, by the way. It is an excellent show. It covers a lot of the scandals that you heard in the Mr. McMahon documentary and just expands on it tenfold. As such, I have personally heard and seen these stories hundreds of times over before this documentary even came out. And that's probably the biggest downside of the Mr. McMahon series. It really doesn't provide anything new, it just takes all of the information and gives it to a general audience who might not know this stuff yet, while using the most recent controversies to draw in an audience, which is probably the least ethical aspect of it, is the fact that they are using abused victims as a way to advertise both this documentary and Raw on Netflix. So there you go, I do have to criticize that. But you know what, it did work, I watched it, so there you go, take it with a grain of salt.
Ooh, a piece of candy. Okay, Brian, next time let's remember this right away because he's done this twice.
For me personally, the things that I found interesting were the small bits of information they managed to pull from Vince McMahon, who was not willing to talk all that much despite having hundreds of hours worth of interviews. I swear it would be an easier job trying to get information out of a man with no tongue than to get Vince McMahon to talk about his own life. For a lot of the things he said, they were just outright lies, but there were some bits of information in there that I found super interesting. Number one was his view on winning. You see, he brought up his stepfather, who used to abuse him terribly, and he saw it as a victory every time he came out of it breathing. As long as he was still alive, he considered it a win. He didn't care how it happened. He could lie, he could steal, he could cheat, it didn't matter. He was still alive, so he had won. I wonder if that translated to anything later in his life. He even made a comment later in the documentary that he doesn't really enjoy winning, it's expected from him. If he doesn't win, then he views it as death itself. Which probably explains why he gets so defensive when anyone beats him at anything, whether it comes to WCW stealing his talent or reporters calling him on his BS. He has this visceral, angry response where he just lashes out. It's fascinating for a guy that seems to love control so much. If he is not ahead, if he is not winning, then he is dying, and he acts like a cornered animal that's completely desperate.
If this turns out to be a grand-scale failure...
You want to let me finish here for a second, pal? You got a situation that you don't know what you're talking about.
The next thing that really stuck out to me was his relationship with his father and how he associated it with work. The only way they ever connected was through work in pro wrestling, which could explain his workaholic tendencies and why he is so hyper fixated on success in pro wrestling, because all of his other business ventures outside of pro wrestling have failed. Bodybuilding, football, restaurants, none of them succeeded. It's all pro wrestling. Without that, he really wouldn't be much of anything. Meaning, in his mind, without his father, he wouldn't be much of anything. Which could explain the next point that I took out of it, his relationships with his own family and kids. Let's face it, that marriage has to be an absolute mess. They're probably only still together legally because of money. He probably has the healthiest relationship with his daughter because she's a lot like him. But there's a problem. He has a lot of hatred for women in him that comes out in the form of abuse and weird storylines. Now, I've never heard anything about him hurting Stephanie at all, but there are some weird storylines that he put her in. But his love for his daughter didn't stop him from betraying her and kicking her out of the company. If that didn't ruin their relationship, I'm sure that Stephanie is more than a little bit upset with how he has treated women throughout his life. And finally, Shane McMahon, who, boy, is Vince totally projecting his own relationship with his father onto his son. Everything that Shane did in wrestling was to make his father proud, but Vince isn't exactly the type to pat someone on the shoulder and tell them they did a good job. There was even a story from the infamous Paul Heyman, who said that Vince once told Shane that he was going to have to stab his father in the heart in order to get his way, that he would have to take over and kick Vince out if he wanted to be in charge. Which, you know, might explain why Shane is completely out of wrestling altogether and probably isn't on speaking terms with his father. Thankfully, from what little we've seen from Shane and his own sons, Shane has decided not to continue this weird cycle. So there's that positive at least.
Wait, that's dumb.
What?
You're not trying to help me. You just have some weird obsession with keeping this lantern lit. It's almost like your soul is in this lantern.
Vince McMahon's odd relationship with his family is made even stranger by the fact that he has a fatherly relationship with a lot of the different pro wrestlers that he's worked with. The wrestlers themselves mention that Vince McMahon is a father figure to them. And considering that Vince always calls everyone in WWE an extended family, I think that he just has a very twisted view on everything. He often says that things are just business, but that everyone in WWE is a family, and he treats any attack against him like a fight for his life. The man is a weird puzzle, and I would love to hear more about his existence, just to find out why he is the way he is. But this is probably going to be the last interview that he ever does. I have seen pictures of him now that he is no longer working in the WWE, and he does not look happy. If he gets through all the lawsuits and beats the federal government again, because they are once again going after him, this time because of misuse of funds, which they are more likely to get him this time because he has done that, and it's the IRS we're talking about. They can get anyone. So probably the next bit of Mr. McMahon documentary is probably going to be post-mortem, because they were very careful with this one because they did not want to get involved in any lawsuits whatsoever, but they also wanted to distance themselves from Mr. McMahon. So there you go. Overall, I really like the documentary, especially the editing. I don't know how they made some of that old footage look good, but they did. And with the interviews, the standouts were Paul Heyman, Tony Atlas, and Booker T. All of them were fantastic and hilarious. I love those guys. But what did you think? Did you see the Mr. McMahon documentary? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Please leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And remember, if you disagree with all of this, that's fine. After all, everyone is entitled to their objectively wrong opinion.
Man, I'm glad I called that guy.
Thank you all so much for watching.
You're still here?
Good night, everybody. Thank you. You bye. Boom.
Do not despair.